Hey guys, today we'll learn how to conduct IT internal audit, a step-by-step guide. So before that, what is an internal IT audit, right? It is a systematic evaluation of an organization's IT, that is information technology, systems, processes, controls conducted by internal auditors. So in simple terms, it's like giving your organization's computer systems and technology a thorough checkup. Just like you might go to the doctor for a health checkup, your organization gets internal auditors to check if everything in its IT systems is working well, safe from cyber threats, and following all the rules and regulations. So the auditors might look at things like how data is stored and protected, if the employees have the right access to access information, whether the technology is helping the organization run smoothly, and many things like this. So after the audit, they give a report with suggestions for fixing any problems they find and making things work even better. So this is all about making sure the organization's tech is healthy, secure, and doing its job effectively. So internal audits are conducted by auditors who are employed by the organization itself, okay, rather than any external audit firms. Now let's look at its steps. The first one is defining audit objectives and scope. In this, the first step is to understand organizational objectives. So you begin by understanding the overall goals and objectives of the organization. These could include improving operational efficiency, enhancing data security, ensuring regulatory compliance, or achieving specific business objectives. And the next step is based on this organizational objectives, you identify specific audit objectives. So these are the objectives that the audit aims to achieve. These could include things like assessing the effectiveness of IT controls and processes, evaluating compliance with relevant regulations, standards, and policies, identifying and mitigating security risks and vulnerabilities, reviewing the efficiency and effectiveness of IT operations, and assessing the reliability and integrity of IT systems and data. So once you're done with the audit objectives, you need to consider stakeholder expectations. That is to take into account the expectations and requirements of key stakeholders, including senior management, the board of directors, regulatory bodies, and internal audit committees. So you need to consult with these stakeholders to understand their concerns, priorities, and areas of interest related to IT governance, risk management, and compliance. The next step is to define audit scope. So here you determine the boundaries and extent of the audit by defining the scope. Let's see some of the items that the audit scope should specify. First one is systems, processes, and areas of the organization that will be included in the audit. Next, any exclusions or limitations that will not be covered in the audit. So these exclusions could be specific departments, locations, servers, or technologies. Next item that you could specify is the time frame of the audit. That is including the period under review and the duration of the audit engagement. After the audit scope, the next step is to consider risk assessment. Here you conduct a preliminary risk assessment to identify potential risks and vulnerabilities that impact the IT environment. So you use these risk assessment techniques to prioritize areas for audit scope based on the likelihood and impact of risks. So if you want to know more about risk assessment, there's a separate video which talks in depth about it. I will link it in the description box. After considering risk assessment, The next step is to clearly document audit objectives and scope in an audit charter or engagement letter. And this document should be formally approved by relevant stakeholders such as senior management or the audit committee. And you need to make sure that the audit objectives and scope are communicated effectively to all members of the audit team and other stakeholders involved in the audit process. And then you also need to make sure that you refine the objectives and scope as needed based on feedback from stakeholders, changes in the business environment, or new regulatory requirements. So, this is what you do in the first step, that is audit objectives and scope. Let's go to the second step now. This is to establish audit criteria. And in this, you select the relevant standards and frameworks. So, you identify the standards, regulations, and frameworks applicable to the organization's industry, jurisdiction, and business requirements. So, some of the common frameworks used for IT audits are, the first one is ISO IEC 27001. This is the Information Security Management Systems ISMS standard. Another common one is NIST CSF, that is Cybersecurity Framework. This is the framework for improving cybersecurity posture. And then there is COBIT. COBIT stands for Control Objectives for Information and Related Technologies. This is the framework for IT governance and management. Another common framework is ITIL, stands for Information Technology Infrastructure Library. This is the framework for IT service management. So there are separate videos on ISO, NIST, CSF. I will link all of them in the description box. You also need to consider industry specific regulations and guidelines such as HIPAA. HIPAA stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Then there is GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations. Then there is PCI DSS, that is Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or SOX. Once you select the standard or framework, the next step is to tailor criteria to organizational context. That is, you customize the audit criteria to reflect the specific needs, risks, and objectives of the organization. And you need to align the audit criteria with the organization's business processes, IT infrastructure, and strategic goals. You also need to consider industry best practices and benchmarks when defining audit criteria to ensure relevance and effectiveness. After this, you define measurable criteria. That is, you ensure that the audit criteria are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. That is SMART. You use quantitative and qualitative metrics wherever possible to assess the effectiveness and maturity of IT controls and processes. You also define clear benchmarks and thresholds for evaluating compliance and performance against the audit criteria. After this, you identify control objectives and requirements that need to be met to achieve compliance with selected standards and frameworks. Break down these control objectives into specific control activities and measures that can be evaluated during the audit. Also consider control domains such as access control, change management, incident response, data protection, and business continuity. Next step is to consider risk factors. So you need to take into account the organization's risk profile and risk appetite when establishing the audit criteria. Focus on high risk areas and critical controls that are essential for mitigating key risks to the organization. Also, prioritize audit criteria based on the likelihood and impact of the associated risks. Once you do all this, the next step is to document all of this, the audit criteria. The document needs to be very structured and organized. It should be very clear so that everybody can understand it. That is the relevant stakeholders, including audit team members, management, and audit committees. Also, make sure to keep the audit criteria updated and aligned with changes in regulation standards and organizations' requirements. Also, make sure that you review the audit criteria periodically to ensure relevance, accuracy, and alignment with organizational objectives and industry best practices. And you need to validate the audit criteria through peer review, consultation with subject matter experts, and pilot testing in representative areas of the organization. After establishing audit criteria, the next step is to plan the audit. In this, first is to review and finalize the objectives and scope, that is, audit objectives and scope, ensuring alignment with organizational goals, regulatory requirements, and stakeholder expectations. Once you do that, the next step is to develop the audit plan. So you create a detailed audit plan that outlines the approach, methodologies, timelines, and resources required for the audit. And then you specify the audit procedures, techniques, and tools that will be used to gather evidence and assess compliance with audit criteria. Next, allocate responsibilities and roles within the audit team, including audit leads, team members, and subject matter experts. Next step is to perform a comprehensive risk assessment to identify and prioritize potential risks and vulnerabilities in the IT environment. You need to consider both internal and external factors that may impact the audit, such as changes in technology, regulatory requirements, or business processes. Use risk assessment techniques such as risk matrix, risk registers, and scenario analysis to quantify and evaluate risks. Another step in planning the audit is to identify audit resources. So you determine the resources required to conduct the audit, including personnel, technology, and documentation. Allocate adequate staffing and expertise to ensure that the audit objectives can be achieved effectively. You can also consider the need for specialized skills or external assistance from consultants or third-party audit firms if necessary. The next step is to establish communication channels and protocols for the audit process. This includes regular meetings, status updates, and reporting mechanisms. Define lines of communication between the audit team, management, stakeholders, and any external parties involved in the audit. You need to ensure that there is a clear and transparent communication throughout the audit process to facilitate collaboration and information sharing. The next step is to develop audit procedures. So you develop detailed audit procedures and checklists for each aspect of the audit, including documentation review, interviews, observation, and testing. Then specify sampling methodologies, sample sizes, and criteria for selecting samples to ensure that audit testing is representative and statistically valid. Also, document the steps to be followed during each phase of the audit, from planning and execution to reporting and follow-up. Next step is to ensure compliance with relevant legal and regulatory requirements governing the audit process, including privacy laws, data protection regulations, and confidentiality agreements. You can consult legal counsel or compliance experts to identify any legal or regulatory considerations that may impact the audit plan or procedures. Next is to seek management support and approval for the audit plan, objectives, and scope. Present the audit plan to key stakeholders, including senior management, audit committees, and relevant department heads for review and endorsement. Also, make sure that you address any feedback or concerns raised by stakeholders and incorporate necessary revisions into the audit plan. So these are the items to consider in planning the audit. The next step is to gather information. The first thing you do is to start by reviewing relevant documentation, policies, procedures, guidelines, and standards related to IT operations, security, and governance. So this may include IT policies and procedures manuals, security policies, disaster recovery plans, change management procedures, and IT infrastructure documentation. So you analyze these documentation to understand organizational processes, controls, responsibilities, and compliance requirements. Next is to schedule interviews with key personnel, including IT staff, management, system administrators, and other stakeholders involved in IT operations. So, you conduct structured interviews to gather insights into IT processes, controls, challenges, and areas for improvement. Make sure you ask open ended questions to encourage dialogue and obtain valuable insights into the organization's IT environment. Next is to conduct walkthroughs of critical IT processes, systems, and controls to gain a first hand understanding of how they operate. Observe workflows, data flows, and system interactions to identify potential weaknesses, bottlenecks, or inefficiencies. Document your observations and note any deviations from established policies or procedures. Next is to review system configurations, settings, and parameters to ensure compliance with security standards and best practices. You need to evaluate configurations of servers, network devices, firewalls, and other IT infrastructure components to identify potential vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. Use automated scanning tools or configuration management databases to streamline the review process and identify deviations or discrepancies. The next step is to analyze incident logs, security logs, and change management logs to identify trends, patterns, and anomalies. Review records of security incidents, breaches, and vulnerabilities to assess the effectiveness of incident response procedures and controls. Also, examine change management logs to evaluate the impact of changes on system stability, security, and compliance. After this, the next one is to review asset inventories and asset management systems to ensure accurate and up to date records of IT assets, including hardware, software, and data. So, you need to verify asset ownership, location, configuration, and usage to identify potential risks and compliance issues. Also, assess the adequacy of asset management controls and procedures for tracking and safeguarding IT assets. Next step is to collect evidence, documentation, and artifacts to support audit findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Maintain a systematic approach to evidence collection, ensuring that it is relevant, reliable, and efficient to support audit assertions. You also need to document sources of evidence, date and time of collection, and any relevant contextual information to facilitate review and validation. Next is to engage with external stakeholders such as vendors, contractors, and service providers to gather information on outsourced IT services, security practices, and contractual obligations. You need to review SLAs, that is service level agreements, contracts, and third party assessments to assess the effectiveness of vendor management practices and controls. After gathering information, the next step is to assess risks. You start this by identifying risks and threats that could affect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the organization's IT assets and data. Consider a wide range of risk sources, including internal and external threats, human errors, technical failures, natural disasters, and regulatory changes. Next, gather information from various sources, including documentation, interviews, system logs, incident reports, and security assessments. Review historical data on security incidents, breaches, and vulnerabilities to identify recurring patterns and trends. Next is to evaluate the likelihood or probability of each identified risk occurring based on historical data, expert judgment, and industry benchmarks. Consider factors such as frequency of similar incidents, the effectiveness of existing controls, and changes in the threat landscape. Next step is to assess the potential impact or consequences of each identified risk on the organization's operations, reputation, financials, and compliance. So, here you need to consider the severity of disruptions, financial losses, legal liabilities, and reputational damage that could result from a security incident or breach. Once that is done, the next step is to prioritize risks based on their likelihood and impact. This is to focus on those that pose the greatest threat to the organization. Use risk scoring or risk metrics techniques to categorize risks into high, medium, and low priority categories. Consider the organization's risk appetite and tolerance when prioritizing risks for further analysis and mitigation. Another step is to conduct a qualitative or quantitative risk analysis. This is to further assess and analyze prioritized risks. Qualitative methods assign subjective ratings to risks based on their likelihood and performance. Mostly it will be like high, medium, low. And then we have quantitative methods. This is to quantify, that is, assign a numerical value to the potential financial impact of risks. Like I said before, there is a different video which explains how these are done. It will be in the description box. After this analysis, the next step is to identify existing controls and mitigation measures that are in place to address identified risks. Evaluate the effectiveness and adequacy of controls in mitigating risks and reducing their likelihood or impact. Also, make sure you identify gaps or deficiencies in controls that may need to be addressed through additional measures or improvements. Next step is to document the results of the risk assessment, including identified risks, likelihood, impact, prioritization, and analysis. Clearly communicate findings to relevant stakeholders, including management, audit committees, and risk management teams. Provide recommendations for enhancing risk management practices, strengthening controls, and mitigating identified risks. Next step is to monitor the risk landscape regularly to identify new threats, vulnerabilities, and emerging risks. You need to review and update the risk assessment periodically to ensure that it remains relevant and aligned with the organization's objectives and priorities. After risk assessment, the next step is to conduct testing. Under this, the first thing that you do is to determine the appropriate testing methods based on the audit objectives, scope, and risk factors. And common testing methods can include technical testing, operational testing, and compliance testing. After that, develop detailed test procedures and checklists for each testing method to ensure consistency and thoroughness. And then mention the steps to be followed, data to be collected, and criteria for evaluating test results. Consider sample sizes, sample methodologies, and sampling strategies to ensure that test results are representative and statistically valid. Once you plan the test procedures, the next step is to execute test procedures according to the predefined plan and ensuring adherence to established methodologies and protocols. You need to conduct testing in a controlled environment. This is to minimize disruptions to normal business operations and ensure data integrity and confidentiality. You also need to document observations, findings, and test results in a systematic and organized manner, including any deviations from expected outcomes or compliance requirements. Now let's talk about these common testing methods that we mentioned here. First one is the technical testing. Here you perform technical testing activities such as vulnerability testing, penetration testing, and security assessments. This is to identify weaknesses and vulnerabilities in IT systems and networks. And then here you use automated scanning tools and manual techniques to identify security gaps, misconfigurations, and potential entry points for attackers. And you validate findings through manual verification and follow up testing to confirm accuracy and severity of identified vulnerabilities. The next one is operational testing. So you conduct operational testing to evaluate the effectiveness of IT processes and controls in achieving organizational objectives and compliance requirements. So you observe workflows, data flows, system interactions, and so on to identify gaps, bottlenecks, or inefficiencies in IT operations. Again, you review documentation, policies, and procedures to ensure alignment with best practices and regulatory requirements. The next testing is compliance testing. Here, you verify compliance with relevant regulations, standards, policies through documentation reviews, interviews, and sample testing. So you review documentation such as policies, procedures, contracts, and agreements to ensure adherence to regulatory requirements and internal guidelines. You can also interview key personnel to assess their understanding of compliance requirements and their role in implementing controls. So once you're done with these testing methods, the next step is to analyze test results and observations to identify trends, patterns, and areas of improvement. Compare test results against predefined criteria, benchmarks, and industry standards to assess compliance, effectiveness, and performance. Evaluate the severity and significance of findings to prioritize remediation efforts and recommendations. So, in analyzing test results, the first thing that you will do is review all findings, observations, and test results collected during the audit process. Then you consolidate findings into categories or themes based on commonalities such as control deficiencies, compliance issues, or operational changes. And then you dig deeper to identify the underlying root causes of identified issues and weaknesses. Consider factors such as inadequate controls, process gaps, human error, technical failures, or systematic issues that contribute to the identified findings. And then you evaluate the severity and impact of each finding based on factors such as likelihood, magnitude, and potential consequences. Then you classify findings into categories such as critical, high, medium, and low severity based on their significance and potential impact on the organization. You also need to consider the broader context and risk factors that may influence the significance and relevance of these findings. Take into account factors such as industry standards, regulatory requirements, organizational objectives, and the organization's risk appetite when assessing findings. Next, analyze findings to identify trends, patterns, and recurring issues across different areas of the audit. So you look for commonalities, systemic weaknesses, and areas of systemic risk that may require broader attention and remediation efforts. Then you compare these findings against predefined criteria, benchmarks, and industry standards to assess compliance, effectiveness, and performance. You also evaluate whether findings meet established thresholds, expectations, or best practices and identify any deviations that may require corrective action. Next is prioritizing findings, and this is done based on their severity, impact, likelihood, and significance to the organization. Focus on addressing critical and high priority findings first to mitigate immediate risks and prevent potential harm to the organization. You also provide contextual analysis and insights into the implications of findings for the organization. Clearly communicate the significance and potential consequences of findings to stakeholders, including management, audit committees, and relevant departments. Next item is to develop actionable recommendations. So, based on the analysis of findings, develop actionable recommendations for addressing identified issues and weaknesses. Ensure that recommendations are in the SMART format, that is, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And these should be aligned with the organization's objectives and priorities. After analyzing the findings, the next step is to report results. And this you begin by structuring the audit report in a clear, concise, and logical manner to facilitate understanding and readability. And you need to organize the report into sections, like, for example, executive summary, introduction, scope and objectives, methodology, findings, analysis, conclusions, and recommendations. So the first one is executive summary. So you provide executive summary at the beginning of the report, summarizing key findings, conclusions, and recommendations. So here you highlight the most significant issues, risks, and opportunities identified during the audit, along with their potential impact on the organization. Next, you provide background information on the audit, including the purpose, objective, scope, and methodology. Describe the audit approach and specific considerations or limitations that may have influenced the audit process or findings. Next, you clearly define the audit scope and objectives, including systems, processes, and areas of the organization covered by the audit. Also, make sure that you mention exclusions or limitations that may have affected the audit scope or findings. Next, describe the audit methodology, techniques, and procedures used to gather evidence, assess controls, and validate findings. Provide details on the testing method, sampling strategies, and data collection techniques employed during the audit. Next, present the findings of the audit in a structured and organized manner, grouping them by category or theme. Provide detailed analysis of each finding, including its root cause, severity, impact, and implications for the organization. Use charts, graphs, or visual aids to illustrate trends, patterns, and relationships among findings, if at all it is applicable. Next, summarize the key conclusions drawn from the analysis of findings, highlighting trends, areas of concern, and areas of strength. Provide insights into the overall effectiveness, reliability, and compliance of IT controls and processes based on the audit findings. Next one is to develop actionable recommendations for addressing identified issues, weaknesses, and opportunities for improvement. After this, you can include a section for management response, where management provides feedback on the audit findings and recommendations. Document management's action plan for implementing recommended improvements and addressing identified issues. Next is appendices. So you include any supporting documentation, evidence, or additional information relevant to the audit findings and analysis. Attach audit work papers, testing results, data analysis reports, and other supporting materials as appendices to the main report. Next, you review the audit report for accuracy, completeness, and clarity before finalizing it for distribution. And then you obtain appropriate approvals from audit management, senior management, audit committees, or other relevant stakeholders before releasing the report. Next step is to distribute the audit report to relevant stakeholders, including management, audit committees, IT personnel, and other relevant departments. Also, communicate the key findings, conclusions, and recommendations to stakeholders through presentations, meetings, or other communication channels as needed. After reporting results, the next step is to implement remediation plans. So in this, the first thing that you do is to prioritize recommendation actions based on the severity, impact, significance of identified issues and weaknesses. So you focus on addressing critical and high priority findings first to mitigate immediate risks and prevent potential harm to the organization. Next, you develop detailed action plans for each identified issues or recommendation. So you specify the steps, responsibilities, timelines, and resources required for implementation. Again, you need to make sure that the action plan is in the SMART format, that is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. Next is to assign clear roles and responsibilities for implementing remediation actions to individuals or teams within the organization. So you clearly communicate expectations, deadlines, and accountability measures to ensure that responsible parties understand their roles and obligations. Next is to allocate adequate resources, including personnel, budget, and technology, to support the implementation of remediation actions. Ensure that sufficient resources are available to carry out remediation activities effectively and efficiently. Next, monitor the progress of remediation efforts regularly to ensure that action plans are being implemented according to the schedule and expectations. Track key milestones, deadlines, and performance metrics to assess progress and identify any delays or obstacles. Next is to provide support, guidance, and training to individuals or teams responsible for implementing remediation actions. Offer assistance with overcoming challenges, acquiring necessary skills or resources, and navigating any organizational barriers or constraints. Next is to communicate progress. That is, you communicate any progress updates on remediation efforts to relevant stakeholders, including management, audit committees, and other key decision makers. You provide transparent and timely updates on milestones achieved, challenges encountered, and any adjustments to the remediation plan. Next is to identify and address any roadblocks or obstacles that may come in the way of successful implementation of remediation actions. Collaborate with stakeholders to overcome challenges, resolve conflicts, and find creative solutions to achieve remediation goals. Next step is to validate the effectiveness of remediation actions through follow up reviews, testing, or assessments to ensure that identified issues have been addressed satisfactorily. So, the follow up meetings, validation, and monitoring are important to ensure that the remediation plans are implemented successfully, controls remain effective, and improvements are sustained over time. So, through continuous monitoring of IT controls and processes, organizations can detect deviations or anomalies, assess control effectiveness, and identify opportunities for improvement. So, like I mentioned, you identify any remaining issues or outstanding remediation tasks that may have not been addressed satisfactorily during follow up reviews. You need to take corrective actions to address these issues promptly and effectively, assigning responsibilities and allocating resources as needed. Then also consider to escalate unresolved issues or persistent challenges to senior management or the appropriate governance body for further review and decision making. Also, provide recommendations for additional measures or interventions to address recurring issues and prevent future recurrences. As part of continuous monitoring, implement monitoring mechanisms such as KPIs, that is key performance indicators, then control self assessments, and automated monitoring tools to detect deviations or anomalies in control effectiveness. Next, conduct periodic reviews of IT controls and processes to assess their continued relevance, adequacy, and effectiveness in mitigating risks and achieving organizational objectives. Consider changes in business environments, technical landscape, and regulatory requirements when conducting reviews to ensure that controls remain aligned with these. Next, foster a culture of continuous improvement by encouraging feedback, collaboration, and innovation in the follow up and monitoring process. Use insights gained from follow up activities to identify opportunities for enhancing IT governance, risk management, and compliance practices and driving organizational excellence. So, these are the steps in an internal IT audit. So, you first define audit objectives and scope, then you go to establishing audit criteria, then plan the audit, gather information, assess risks, conduct testing, analyze the findings, report the results, implement remediation plans, and then follow up and monitor. So that's it for today, guys. I hope this video helped you understand a little bit more about IT internal audit. If so, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share our videos. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you again soon. Bye bye.